cost of living is at an all-time high. Much is the experience for the world over. But in South Africa, one of the biggest drivers for that cost of living is the price of electricity. Join us in this week's show as we look at what are the drivers behind the cost of electricity and what can be done about it. Workers' World starts now.
From England to Poland, every step across the ocean, the ruling classes, them is in a mess. Oh yes, the capitalist system a regress, but the Soviet system now progress. So which one of them...
Welcome to our weekly Workers' World Labour Show. I'm your host, Shirik Trubodi, once again. An absolute pleasure having you along as we get into a riveting conversation today, particularly about the fact that South Africans are quite acutely aware of the country's electricity crisis that has caused havoc with most people's lives and the economy for over a decade. There is clearly no end in sight to this particular crisis. Another major aspect of this crisis is the fact that electricity has become unaffordable and unavailable for the majority of people. Yet Eskom and municipalities have regularly increased the cost of electricity way above inflation and with the support of the national energy regulator of South Africa called NERSA. In today's show, we discuss the high cost of electricity, what are its causes, its impact, and more importantly, what can be done about it. But first, let's go to our insert, prepared for us by the Workers' World Media Productions editorial team.
It's women who are affected more because we use electricity for everything at homes and in the household.
No longer do we have the luxury of keeping the geyser on. The geysers and certain things must be switched off. No longer do we have the luxury to use a bath. It's going in.
I'm unemployed and my mother is a pensioner, so it affected us a lot because we have to be aware when we boil water, we are always aware that someone else has to stop boiling the water because that is too much.
Waiting until the first, you're waiting until the first for when that 25 free units and when the tariff is coming down again.
Essentially, Eskom used to run as a non-profit public entity, and it would sell electricity at a price affordable to South African consumers. Now, of course, during apartheid, its mandate wasn't to provide universal access because we had white minority rule. But as apartheid was coming close to end, capitalists and the private sector saw an opportunity to transform Eskom and to realize Eskom as a place to accumulate wealth. And so they said Eskom will now have a private mandate, it will have a corporate mandate, it will have a board of shareholders, and it will sell electricity to raise revenue. And later on, it adopted a full cost recovery model where they said electricity generation and maintenance, that cost is going to be put on end users, who are we as consumers.
The tariffs are hiking. You know, as a working class, it's paining for me to have to spend something like 2,000 rand a month only on electricity. You know, when I buy 200 rand worth of electricity, it only gives me 72 kilowatts, which only lasts me for 4 days. And if you can times that for the whole month, that is almost half of my salary.
So like everybody else, it's affected me financially. It used to be that I could pay 500 rand for electricity for the month, and now it doesn't even last me half the month, especially during winter.
Yadura igezi mina angazi ngoba njengamanje lapha ngihlala khona sezikhona ezinye izinto ngiziswitch off ngendaba yokuthi ngibhadala imali eningi at the end of the month.
Cape Town residents took their fury over the high cost of electricity tariffs to the streets on Saturday.
High electricity tariffs must fall today! Enough should have been enough long ago.
That the city immediately amend the illegal 17.6% it added to the electricity tariffs on 1 July 2023 to correct the NERSA figure of 15.1%.
Our stance is very clear. Our stance, we are with the people on the ground in terms of their outcry that the city of Cape Town must scrap whatever tariff they've put on the table.
I just heard that the mayor's not coming to receive the memorandum. and he's not coming to speak to us. And I say that that is a failure of leadership. He should be here to answer to this demand. What they will also say is that if they were to charge or to increase the tariff by 15.1%, they will lose 500 million rand in revenue. But what they don't tell you is they've got 8.6 billion rand sitting in the bank. 8.6 billion rand sitting in the bank. And they are scared to lose 500 million. They can't support poor people with 500 million rand when they're sitting with 8.6 billion rand in the bank. That is a failure of leadership, and that is on the DA.
My water has been disconnected because of my water arrears, right? And so because of that, the city penalized me because of my arrears. So they took from my electricity units. So for example, I actually bought 20 rand electricity and I got 2 units, okay? I have a home-based ECD. And then, I was worried that the water was disconnected. I hardly get any units.
The city of Cape Town, every time you go and buy electricity, deducts your so-called debt and arrears. And people are now getting 1 unit for 10 rand because the city is taking 90% to pay debt. You don't get the chance to say, I don't owe the money. They just take it.
High tariffs is violent. It's a form of invisible violence against women. The fact that our people are poor is systemic violence against women. This is a month of Women's Month, right? So it is important for, like Tola is saying, it's important for our women to be here because it's mothers that's suffering. It is mothers that don't have money that have to resort to selling their bodies to get a bread's money and a 20 rand for electricity.
Last year's tariff is also higher than the approved NERSA tariff. So for 2 years now, we're going to pay 2% more than we need. They owe us money, credit from last year and credit from this year, and we should not stop here. We need to sue the city for our money back. Pay back the money.
With the increase, it's going to make much worse, and it will affect my budget, because majority of my money goes to electricity and less food. Because even that 3 units has been taken away.
All right, so there we have it. Clearly a very tiresome situation, which I think every South African can attest to. We don't quite need to be in a special circumstance to know that not only is there a problem with the provision of electricity, but also the cost of that electricity, which is a driver of so many other areas in the economy, and that is what causes inflation to rise, and, well, our pockets are under a lot more pressure than what it ordinarily wouldn't have been. We have a series of guests to have this discussion. Andile Zulu, an Energy Democracy Officer at the Alternative Information and Development Center, the AIDC. We have Abida Adams with us, the Provincial Secretary for Givusa and the General Industries Workers Union of South Africa, and Sandra Dixon, the founder of the City of Cape Town, the Stop COCT. Thank you very much, gentlemen and women, for having joined us for this very important conversation. I'd like to maybe start off with you, Andile. The crisis that we're sitting with right now, I suppose, is twofold. One is a provision and a generation of electricity problem, and a cost of that generation problem. How would you describe, I suppose, our energy woes at the moment?
Thank you so much to Cape Town TV for this invitation, and thank you to all the guests. Essentially, what we suffer is an issue of Eskom not having enough supply of electricity to meet the demand within the economy and within the population. And the reason that this occurs is, of course, the crisis of systemic corruption within the utility. But at a more fundamental level, in terms of the true roots of this problem, has been Eskom's gradual corporatization. So, and in regards to electricity tariffs, for example, Eskom in 2001 adopted the full cost recovery model and the user pays principle, which essentially says that if people want a public service, they must pay for it. And Eskom has a mandate to sell electricity to end users, being you and I, and then to use the revenue generated to conduct maintenance and to boost its generative capacity. In other words, to build more power stations. However, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, with record high unemployment and with devastating levels of poverty. This commodification of what is essentially a public good and a basic human need has put Eskom in a situation where it isn't able to generate enough revenue due to the poverty and the unemployment within the population.
Yeah.
It's not able to generate enough revenue to do maintenance and to build new generative capacity, and this is a significant contributor to load shedding.
And I want to just talk about that and pick up on that with you, Abida. The fact that Eskom has adopted a cost recovery model, which in essence Eskom is saying whatever it costs us to produce that unit of electricity, the consumer would have to pay for it. In a normal capitalist system, that sounds pretty above board. Because who is going to subsidize, the loss to Eskom? Please pick up for us on whether that is a fair or an unfair model.
Yeah, thanks, Tashrik. I think also what Andile had said, like that cost recovery model and South Africa being the most unequal society already, just perpetuate and extends that inequality, because now it's really pretty much who can afford to pay, which means that historically it's the black, it's poor people, it's the working class who's now unable to pay or significantly reduce their usage of electricity because based on what they can afford, which then impact on the quality of life. And I think also Andela's touched on that a bit, but it's also, this is pretty much, it's not just Eskom, this is also the government and the ANC's model in terms of their neoliberal policies. So, for example, electricity is a public good, like water, and it should not be a good that we should actually be commodified, because ultimately then who's going to be the most disadvantaged is the poor and the working class. And this is in a state who wants to talk about the developmental state. You can't have policies like that and at the same time want to redress past imbalances. It's not going to happen. So of course it's the poor and the working class who's actually again bearing the brunt and bearing the brunt of this crisis, because it's not just the cost recovery model. I think we are also paying for all the corruption that has been happening at Eskom over the last 10 years or so. And we are also paying for the failure and the inability, maybe not the inability, but the unwillingness of the ANC to change their neoliberal policies. So it's the poor and the working class who will always pay and will always bear the brunt of these crises.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on that after the break with you, Sandra, because there are now other costs that also attach if you are in the city of Cape Town, and that and more we'll pick up once we do return from the break. Do stay with us. We're talking about a burdensome problem of the high cost of electricity, and hinged on that is Eskom and the historical problems at Eskom. So far, we heard about a cost recovery model as well as corruption as the biggest drivers for the high cost of electricity in South Africa. Sandra Dixon, the founder of the Stop the City of Cape Town, you have been campaigning as an organization for greater transparency and at least some degree of influence over how the city comes up with its tariffs. Explain to us why, if I live in the city of Cape Town, I'm paying a little bit more than what I would have paid if I had my electricity supplied by Eskom.
Okay, if it was only a little bit more, it would have been acceptable. We are paying almost a full rand more per tariff than what a direct Eskom supplied customer would pay. But I'd like to latch on and broaden my approach a little bit for this program and actually address the Eskom issues as well. And both the previous two speakers raised excellent points, and the one that I do sort of latch onto is the fact of the new liberalism that's been implemented in South Africa for the past 20 years. Now, what had happened at Eskom is that basically the control was lost. There's a war inside Eskom between the new liberalists, whom wants to bring in renewables and that sort of advocates climate change and wants to get rid of coal. So that fight had been raging within Eskom, unbeknown to the public, for more than a decade now. The result that it had was that there were plenty gaps created, because I'm busy reading the new proposed amended Energy Regulation Act, where the public has got the opportunity to give input up to the 13th of October. And to my horror, I saw that this act was already in its making in February 2022. And as a citizen, I was made aware of this act and what is happening behind the scenes in the last couple of days. So Eskom and our political arena is operating in a vacuum where us as consumers are being excluded grossly. I did find one little sentence in that act where it says, oh, maybe the consumers aren't fully represented here, and then I ask even my fellow panelists, have they seen this act where there's a debate at the moment going on, but the act is ready to be implemented, where they want to move to a free market pricing model. So to move away from the costing model. And just before I speak more about the free market, a free market model, the costing model failed because it is shrouded in secrecy. Anything and everything that basically affects us as consumers, we have to dig to find information and to actually be kept into the loop. But yes, every 1st of April and 1st of July.
I just want to pick up on that with Andile, the ability to implement a costing model that is fair based on what it costs to produce electricity versus the burdening debt problem. Because if we looked at Eskom at least 15, 20 years ago, it was a different beast altogether, one where there was still a high degree of subsidization from the state to consumer. At the moment, the state says it cannot continue to pursue that particular trajectory. How then do you balance a almost socialist approach to the provision of electricity versus a burdensome debt? Because the argument is somebody has to quite pay for that, Andile.
Oh, my apologies. The debt issue is quite a significant crisis at Eskom, and it is one of the things that contributes to a drastic increase in tariffs over the past 15 years. However, if we look at the sources of Eskom's higher costs, we see that they're in the short term, the short to medium term, there is some ways to relieve those costs. One of the ways that we propose is canceling Eskom's debt to the World Bank. We think the loans that were taken out to build Medupi and Kusile were illegitimate. They were mired in corruption, or rather they facilitated corruption and resulted in a lot of construction delays, design issues. But moreover, we also think there's been a drastic increase in the price of coal and a drastic inflation of procurement contracts for coal as well. We think Eskom needs to have the authority to be able to say we need to set a price on coal. But even more than that, a great cost to Eskom is power purchase agreements to get power from independent power producers. So currently, Eskom spends about 43 billion rand on these power purchase agreements. And these IPPs only give us about 8% of installed capacity. So there needs to be a negotiation with independent power producers and a reconfiguration of those power purchase agreements, which cost us a lot and don't give us that much energy in the long term, in fact. But another significant contributor to the costs, and this is quite significant, is the fact that you have 27 corporations known as the energy intensive users groups, which consume over 40% of Eskom's energy output, and yet they pay the same amounts of rates in terms of tariffs as the rest of us. I think that's a drastic and unjustifiable inequality in terms of how Eskom gathers revenue. Why should big businesses pay the same amount of electricity as compared to someone who is simply a single mother taking care of 2 kids? So we think in the short to medium term, Eskom can renegotiate the price of coal, it can renegotiate IPP contracts, and it can also demand that there is more equity in terms of the price of electricity for businesses and for ordinary consumers as well. Yeah. But in terms of the long-term goals,
there is fiscal room for Eskom to get debt relief, so long as it does not come at the cost of other public services and social goods.
Abida, what I'm hearing is a different kind of state capture. You know, Sandra raised the issue here of the secrecy around the cost of electricity, including the independent power producers. Andile also talks there about the cost of coal, etc. It does seem to me that while we are all struggling, there are people that are feasting over the minerals and the resources required to produce electricity.
Yes, indeed, Tashrik. I think Eskom, like all the other state SOEs, was not spared in terms of state capture. But I think we also have to go broader than just state capture and the corruption, which costs us a lot. But also what Andile said, especially with the odious debt for Kusile, the building of Kusile and Medupi. And I think that we really should be all supporting that campaign to, for example, for those debt to be written off. But I think more than that, I think probably that is where we would differ, for example, with Sandra, is that as a trade union and, you know, protecting the interests of the workers and the working class, I think it's also important for us to say that Eskom is a public good. It must be saved, but it must also be transformed. And one of the, I mean, like the cost of electricity, and for us, if we're going to continue using coal and nuclear power, it's not just the price per kilowatt that we are paying, but it's also the price to the environment that we are paying. And then what is the legacy then that we are leaving for our children? So I think what should also be part of the conversation is that we need to get to cleaner energy. We need to get to green energy, and we need to look at renewables. I mean, I've done some reading, for example, and I read the one publication in terms of the whole campaign for a new Green Deal, that how the prices are significantly reduced in terms of producing renewable energy, wind, solar, etc. So that should be part of the conversation. It cannot be business as usual, and we need to take into consideration the environmental costs and the impact that it has, because we still have to pay for it. I mean, we can already see what is happening now if we look at all the floods and the droughts and the things that we have in South Africa. And also South Africa is a water scarce country. So if we're going to continue using expensive coal that is not good for the environment and the consumption of water, it's also what does it mean for the long term? So that really should be part of our discussion, but we should also reject at the same time independent power producers, because then the issues of market comes to play and issues of profit and all this, and it's a public good.
And the fact that it doesn't help that it is shrouded in secrecy. I remember the 27 independent power producers whose names were not disclosed, some of which had close links to the ANC and to the president himself. But what is the role of the National Energy Regulator is the question we're asking a bit later, and why is it not coming to the protection of consumers? We'll talk about that and more once we do return from the break. To stay with us. All right, a number of problems in the determination about how we come to the cost of electricity in this country. There's a background issue with the price of debt that Eskom has accrued to build new power stations, and that has been riddled with corruption, as we've heard in this program. We've heard about a cost recovery model that says whatever amount of money Eskom spends in the generation of electricity, that is the sort of money that must be recovered, which is, again, an issue as it has been raised here. But what are the protections in place for the South African consumer? One would have thought that is the role of the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NERSA, but in fact the trends have shown that NERSA has been increasing the price of electricity, or at least giving the headway for that increase based on what Eskom is requesting above in inflation. And let's pick up on that very quickly with you, Andile. The fact that we sit with above inflation increases because, again, cost recovery and debt and all of those are taken into consideration. How practical is that, given the state of the South African market and the economy? All right, we'll come back to Andile. Sandra, you want to take that one? Why it would appear there's no consumer protection in place through NERSA, and why NERSA appears to be increasing or giving the go-ahead for the price of electricity above inflation?
NERSA had been pretty much on the consumer side, because I personally have been involved in the sending of replies from the public to NERSA. For instance, last year, Eskom asked for over 30%, and NERSA gave them half of it. They gave them 15.1%, actually to Eskom 18.6%, and to municipalities 15.1%. So NERSA had been between a rock and a hard place. So on the one side, NERSA is being pressured by very powerful lobbyists, Eskom's attorneys, as well as huge companies, and where it was mentioned earlier that huge companies, they are in fact not paying the same as consumers, they are paying less. They are getting favorable deals to pay less. And then the brunt comes down to the consumer, which is then felt down at municipal level. So we cannot fully blame NERSA, but over the last 5 years, NERSA's teeth the few teeth that they did have, had been pulled. They lost their chairman, various other people that used to be in the consumers camp, they are no longer there. NERSA was taken to court by Eskom on 5 occasions during the last 2 years, and NERSA lost every single court case. That has to do with very technical issues between Eskom's ability to claw back money. So to explain to the viewer what clawing back means, is that Eskom says they are going to get, say, 100 billion of revenue, and they only get in 90 billion in that financial year. They have the right to claw back that 10 billion from us as consumers. Now, there's lots of issues around that, and unfortunately, NERSA lost all 5 those court cases, which to me raises red lights if our courts are just basically reducing NERSA to a nothing. Now one can say, yes, NERSA does not have the expertise.
Abida, whether the framework for how we understand the provision of electricity then is the problem, because NERSA also, as Sandra rightfully says, has had a beating in the courts, in which the courts has now determined that its methodology to determine the price of electricity is in fact problematic. And so what we're seeing at the moment, I suppose, is the use of the courts and the legislation, whatever framework is in place, to skew it in favor of Eskom, Abida, and I'm wondering whether that is a role for government to step in there and reorganize the way in which we understand the provision of electricity.
Well, yeah, I think absolutely, Tashri, because I think what is also important in terms of, I think I just need to touch on the role of NERSA. NERSA, I've tried to check in terms of the regulatory board and who's on the board, and I'm speaking under correction, for example, but I have not seen anybody there specifically representing the interests of the consumers. And I'm not talking about the big consumers, which is a big challenge. You cannot have a regulatory authority who decides on pricing, right? And then we have a situation where, if you look, I've looked at the data, for example, they say that between 2007 and 2022, the Eskom tariff has increased 653%. So how has NERSA been on the side of the consumer? During that same period, inflation for that period was 129%. So already one can see there. So NERSA might have done. I know that normally they allow public participation. There's a lot of people who make submissions to these roadshows or whatever they call it. But I have not seen really, particularly from a practical point of view, for example, how that submission we make as the public is taken into consideration. And I think also here's again the role for the government, and again it comes down to regulation and what we say, what is the role of Eskom, And I think for us as organized labor, that we believe that Eskom is a public entity. It's a public good. It should not have this cost recovery model. It should not be run as a business where a lot of money, Eskom spend a lot of money on management and executive management, for example, on costs, and that is the model that we need to change. There should be an entity who is providing a service to the South African society, And we know the importance of provision of electricity for our sustainability, not just for the working class, because, I mean, workers are not going to be able to work if there's no electricity. We know what is happening during load shedding already, and it's impacting on workers, where some workers are put on short time, they are laid off because there's uncertainty on electricity. So it does play a key role in our economy and our society. So there needs to be regulation, but not for getting profit.
But just on that point, Abida, just on that point, I want to bring Andile in very quickly before we go for a break. And Andile, you're welcome to give your input very quickly on NERSA, but I want to just test with you the argument that splitting Eskom into 3 different divisions will begin to manage the debt and the burden of Eskom's supply to the country a little bit better. Are the two exclusively going to be of detriment to society?
So the plans for unbundling, where you take apart Eskom's generation, transmission, and distribution components, is a plan that is likely to be a disaster from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of many progressive organizations. Firstly, it means that your energy system is lost to multinational corporations and domestic big business. It means that you as a state no longer have control over your energy policy, or at least as much control as you used to before. It also means then we won't be able to deal with energy poverty. As Abida and Sandra have mentioned, there are over 10 million South Africans who do not have safe and affordable, reliable access to electricity. What the World Bank and the IMF want to do with our energy system is turn it into a competitive market where there will be not full cost recovery models, but cost reflective tariffs that are going to reflect the true costs of producing energy. And so you're likely to have a situation which we will see a drastic rise in the price of electricity for a population that is mostly unemployed and that is mostly poor. But there are also many concerns about, is this going to actually give us the planning and the capacity and the coordination to be able to confront climate change if our energy system is now in the hands of private players? So if you look at liberalized or free market ways of running energy systems in the past 40 years, they have resulted in failure. They have resulted in unaffordable tariffs. They have resulted in people not being protected when there is a crisis, whether it is economic or whether it is a natural disaster of some sort. And they have also resulted in countries not being able to deal with climate change because their energy systems are underneath private control. We think liberalized energy markets have failed in the United Kingdom and in many European countries. They have failed in South America. They have failed in Central Africa. So why are we pursuing the same path if it simply results in more energy poverty and higher profits for a few amounts of people? We think that Eskom must be transformed, and it must be owned by the public, and it must be democratized. Otherwise, we are going to have more energy poverty, and we won't be able to confront the climate crisis.
Sure, and I want to pick up on that after the break. You know, the fact that Eskom needs to be protected, but protected against itself or from the politicians. We'll answer that after the break. Do stay with us. All right, welcome back. We're talking about the high cost of electricity in this country and what are the drivers behind it. It's largely been a very big academic discussion, but an important one to understand where we root the problem of Eskom and the provision of electricity. Of course, we've heard thus far that not only is there a cost recovery model that is highly problematic, we've spoken about the role of NERSA in the last segment and how particularly not only has it been, facing forces from external, be it largely from Eskom and elsewhere, and the fact that it hasn't had a great track record in winning its cases in court. None of the decisions that NERSA appears to have been taken is, firmly rooted in a people-centric approach. We've heard, and to the end of our discussion there as well, in our last segment, the efforts to unbundle Eskom, as is the focus of the Ramaphosa administration. And one of the issues there is the big cost of debt as well. Abida, I want to throw in another, particular, I suppose, lion in the mix here, and that is the just energy transition. Sold to South Africa as a way to pursue greener, forms of electricity and the generation of that electricity, but it would appear that it isn't quite on the surface level of what we are being sold. So what is your sense about the just energy transition and whether in fact it's a liability for South Africans?
Look, I don't think, I mean, where we are standing as GIWUSA and as organized labor, a just energy transition is important for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is affordability, but as I alluded to earlier, it's not just affordability in terms of rands and cents. It is also the impact on the environment. And in the environment, because if we are going to continue with dirty energy and with coal, it does have impacts in terms of the environment, in terms of our water scarcity, that we are a water scarce country. But then also when we talk about a just energy transition, we're also talking about sustainable jobs for workers. So in other words, training, so it's when you shut down a power station, a coal power station, it doesn't mean that thousands of workers must now be unemployed and then have a devastating impact on the community. When we talk about a just energy transition, we are talking about ensuring those million climate jobs, because in terms of the projections that has been made and the research that has been made, it's proven that if we change over and we transition to that greener energy, we are going to need capacity in terms of workers. So workers needs to be retrained so that they'll be able to do their job. But what we mean by just energy transition is not in the hands of private owners. We want a publicly owned by the workers and by communities. So in other words, also so that we can have that say, so that there can't be the secrecy around pricing, so that we don't have a situation, for example, where mining and other consumers, intense consumers of energy, are paying even less than what I'm paying, and we are subsidizing, you know, big industry in terms of their energy consumption. So there are a number of things. So, and for us, the position is that Eskom can play that role if it is transformed, but it must also be protected in the sense so that we do not have a situation where it can be captured by any entity, or that it can be used by the different political factions and formations for their own political agendas. So it must be a publicly owned Eskom where there's the interest of the consumers and of the South African society, not just of big industry, or that our interests are protected. So that is what we are saying. And we're talking about a just energy transition also means affordable energy. For example, I know Sandra is more of an expert on this, but in terms of the city of Cape Town, I don't even know whether they still do the free electricity, whatever. They found ways, it means, are not even providing that. But what do you do if you cannot afford to buy it? Because the current model of cost recovery is you only get what you pay for. So if you pay for nothing, you get no electricity. What does that mean for a poor working class? What does that mean in terms then, because we can link it with the health, we can link it with education, because if young people, if there's no electricity, there's no energy, they can't do research for their work. They have to use candlelights to study and all this kind of thing. And then it's just, we are continuing and perpetuating that inequality, and that generations after generations who does not have access to opportunity because they are energy poor.
Yeah, and I think that energy poverty has been around for quite some time, but is increasingly affecting more and more communities, particularly the middle class as well. Andile, your sense about the energy transition, or the just energy transition, which, to be honest, is a contestable issue, purely because of ownership, what forms of electricity we are talking about, and sustainability thereof. I've been hearing a lot of people saying, well, look at now, it's winter in Russia and in Germany and elsewhere, and they're having to revert back to coal, for instance. Well, what is your sense, Andile, about how just this transition can become?
Yes, so it's a question of justice. I mean, I don't think anyone who's reasonable doubts the reality of climate change and that we need to move away from fossil fuels. The question is, who is going to own energy? How is it going to be produced? How are workers going to be taken care of? What are the environmental regulations around this? And what we've discovered with our research is that the Just Energy Transition Partnership is a transition led by elites. The idea is we will give you the financing in order to transition away from fossil fuels, on the condition that you make this transition profitable. This transition will be led by the profit incentive. And that's why they want to unbundle Eskom. You unbundle Eskom, you create a competitive energy market, and you allow for the penetration of green multinationals and green domestic big business. And so what the states then must do, we must change our monetary laws, our industrial laws, our tax laws, in order to accommodate the private sector, both globally and domestically. And so there's a reason why we've been seeing interest rate hikes. There's a reason why we've been seeing budget cuts to the public sector. There's a reason why we've been seeing an attack on organized labor as well, because they want the economy to be one in which labor is cheap and accessible, one in which there are not heavy taxes, one in which there is not heavy regulation, one in which there aren't environmental regulations that get in the way of them having to extract certain minerals in order to develop these green technologies. What we're simply saying is that you cannot stop the climate crisis led by the profit incentive, the same profit incentive that created the climate crisis in the first place.
Yeah.
I agree with Abida and I agree with
sorry, Andile, I just wanna
organizations
pick up
like the CJC.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that very quickly. Sandra, do you believe that the just energy transition is a viable tool within our arsenal to bring the reform so required? But I've heard what Abida and what Andile is saying is, let's protect Eskom, but let's also not necessarily be throwing the baby out with the bath water. What is your sense about the just energy transition?
Well, at present, the way it is being implemented is completely inefficient, ineffective. It's not working and everybody is suffering. If it needs to be implemented, it should be done in a staged manner. Now, as far back as 1917, I said to the CEO of Eskom at the time, I can't remember who it was, that because I attended one of their presentations where they were complaining about selling less electricity. And because they were selling less electricity, they said that is enough justification to put up the prices. That was in 2017 already. And then I stood up in the audience and I said, but if you look at market conditions, if you run a proper business or even a government, if you want more revenue, you need to sell more. You cannot now, because you are selling less electricity, all of a sudden now increase the prices to make up for it. People listened, some in the audience laughed, and the CEO of Eskom just walked away. And it's now 6 years later, and we can see municipalities are still doing the same thing. When they do their cost application at NERSA, one of the reasons that the City of Cape Town puts in is that we are selling less electricity, now we want to charge more.
Yeah.
Now, the solution I then suggest is you cannot just go and switch off your coal power stations overnight. It should be what the word says, a transition.
Yeah.
And the interesting figure about the transition at this point in time is that only under 2 gigawatts of the 30 odd needed is renewables at present.
Sure.
So what
Sandra,
transition
I tried to hold that as long as I possibly could. I'm going to have to go for a break, but once I do return from the break, we'll pick up on that point as well as what the provision of free electricity is in this country, if there is any. We'll talk about that and more after the break. Please stay with us.
We are an online news website that brings you news, analysis and perspectives from working class, marginalized communities and labor.
Kule mali esikhiphayo ku-government kungcono kakhulu than ukuhlukunyezwa lokho esikuhlukunyezwa ngamapolisi.
Elicha is published by Workers World Media Productions and is a bilingual website as we cover labor, health, education and local government issues in English and isiXhosa. To get community, national and international news from Elicha, please subscribe to our website and download our mobile app.
All right, we are talking about the high cost of electricity, as has been the conversation over the last couple of minutes, and it's been a very complex one because there are, of course, considerations about cost recovery model to the price of electricity, to NERSA, to unbundling of Eskom, and of course, the latter part of our discussion there, which was a just energy transition, which is a completely different pathway to realize how we generate electricity, both from a cost perspective, an environmental perspective, and a sustainability perspective as well. I want to begin to wrap up, and we're in our last segment. Sandra, just to start off with you very quickly on this issue around the provision of indigent grants, which the City of Cape Town, for instance, has. Do they work, and do they work most appropriately where required?
Yes, Cape Town still has indigent grants, and it is reasonably extensively implemented. The last figure I saw is that around about 172,000 people benefit from it. However, what has been the talking topic over the last, well, since the last tariff increases, is the fact that people fall behind with bills. So those that can pay and that has to pay for their services, the action where the people that earn above 7,500, which is the cut-off to register as a indigent person, has become not adequate anymore. And the talk on our WhatsApp groups, on our Facebook groups, and even personal emails that we are receiving is that the payment of bills had become absolutely critical. And people are falling prey to, when they cannot pay their bills anymore, that there are extreme debt collection policies that comes into play. Now, what I conclude from the change in the topic, where people used to complain, oh, the tariffs are high, but people manage to pay. Where now it's changing, people cannot, your working class cannot pay their bills anymore. So therefore, the pricing has reached a critical mass where more and more substantial number of the population just cannot afford buying electricity anymore.
And that's
so it
on
is
that
now
point. I just want to
affecting
come on that
everybody.
point, Sandra, with Abida, because the reality is that she is correct, Abida, because if you look at the qualifying criteria for a provision of free electricity in this country, you need to live in a house that is what, barely 800,000 rand, and these days properties valuations, you can barely buy a house for 800,000 rand, together with the fact that there must be very little to no income at the particular property. But just because somebody is at the lower tier of the middle class doesn't quite mean they are able to afford it. And therein is, again, a different cycle of poverty that confronts the lower end of the middle class, isn't it, Abida?
Yeah, I think that's because it's very similar to what we see even in tertiary education, where they talk about the missing middle, right? So even, yeah, I mean, if you consider also Sandra's number there, which was saying about 176,000 people who's qualifying, who gets the indigent grant. That is not a thing, that is a drop in the ocean. If we look for overall how many people we have in Cape Town, because also I'm aware of that, the process is very onerous to apply for that indigent grant in terms of the requirements, etc., etc. But we also have a situation, let alone the middle class. If I rent somebody's property, I don't qualify because I'm not the owner, but I have to pay that electricity. And that is a lot of the time what happens. And also, I'm not sure about other municipalities, but also what the City of Cape Town does, whether you're the owner or not. If you buy electricity and there's arrears of rates, they take up to 90% for that rates arrears from the electricity thing. So that actually makes it even more difficult for people. I already don't own the house. I'm a tenant, I'm renting. I can be lower middle class or I can be working class. I have to pay my electricity. I'm trying to buy electricity. But now if I want to buy 500 rands worth of electricity, the 90% of that 500 rand goes towards debt for rate. So that is the other thing that is compounding the issue that makes people in Cape Town energy poor. And of course, then it's about affordability, because if we look now in terms of the trends of the electricity, tariff increases does not hold with what workers are getting in terms of wage increases. I can tell you over the last 2 or 3 years, the average wage increase, if we are lucky to get a wage increase because all the employers are claiming poverty, so still since COVID, it's about 6.5%. But what the electricity increased significantly more. And then also we're not even taking into consideration the food inflation. So that is really compounding the issue in terms of affordability. So maybe when you run the numbers and you say when somebody earns 10,000 Rand, they should be able to afford, but they can't because of other factors that's pushing up that prices and the other concerns. So really, I mean, like, electricity is not affordable. And that is why we are saying if it's a publicly owned, we are not in support, for example, of unbundling. They can call it unbundling. We know it's privatization.
It most certainly does. It most certainly does smell like it. I'm out of time. Andile, let's wrap up with you very quickly. Electricity as a public good. How do we begin to reorientate the conversation in that way to inform how we deal with all of these complexities around the provision and the cost of electricity?
I think firstly we have to recognize that the current model of corporatization has failed. It has not reduced energy poverty, and it has produced load shedding, which leads to a series of other issues. And we need to recognize that this kind of corporatization has failed in other parts of the world as well. The second thing that we need to realize is that electricity should be considered a fundamental human right. It is impossible to pursue any kind of development if people do not have a reliable and safe access to energy. So firstly, that is, I think, the beginning of how we reconceptualize energy production and ownership and governance in South Africa. And the last thing we need to recognize is all of this occurs in the context of the climate and ecological crisis. The planet, we are reaching the boundaries for how we are abusing and exploiting the planet. And it's going to cause a series of extreme weather events that are going to lead to mass hunger, that are going to lead to infrastructure damages, that are going to lead to mass migration. And so the question of how we own and use energy must then come under the consideration of the climate crisis as well. And all these factors, I think, push us to realizing that energy production and ownership must be democratized, that Eskom must be a publicly owned utility that has the mandates first and foremost to deal with the basic needs of South Africans within the context of climate change and within the context of sustainable, renewable energy ownership and production.
Sure.
If Eskom is not transformed and democratized, we not only will still have load shedding and energy poverty, we won't be able to deal with the climate crisis.
And therein, I suppose, lies the biggest threat that we sit with right now. It is a complex set of problems, one that is certainly, or some of these that is certainly defined by pure incompetence, others willful efforts to try and mislead the public, and of course the requirement to center this conversation as electricity as a public good. I hope this enriches the conversation in moving forward in understanding why the price of electricity is as high as it is. Thank you very much for tuning in. Until we chat again, have a lovely day. Bye-bye.